Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Backbench Committee for agreeing that this important topic be debated prior to the closure of the consultation on the proposals for the reform of legal aid in England and Wales. The consultation paper proposes to cut to an estimated total of about £350 million from the civil legal aid budget. Roughly two-thirds of these cuts are directed at those people who are currently legally aidable, and one-third is to come from remuneration cuts to providers who are expected to do the same work but for less money. £279 million is being cut from civil legal aid. Around 500,000 people are going to lose their entitlement to legal aid. The majority of these come from low-income households, and the Ministry's own Equality Impact Assessment acknowledges that these will be predominantly women, black and minority ethnic people, and ill and disabled people. However, whilst the consultation acknowledges this, it also says it's not just about cost. It's the right thing to do. I believe that I can demonstrate that both the cost argument and the statement that it is the right thing to do are both incorrect. And in fact, the implementation of these proposals to reduce the civil legal aid will hit the poorest hardest, it'll increase the cost to other public bodies, and it'll have a potentially catastrophic effect on advice agencies, not-for-profit advice agencies, including citizens' advice bureaus and law centres.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I'll give way.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend, and I congratulate her on securing this debate. Does she not agree that one of the issues that ought to be addressed is the issue of poor decision-making by public authorities? In particular, for example, in the immigration field, where the UK Border Agency fails to make good decisions based on good evidence. And that is why people have to go to the tribunal, and that is why they need legal aid.
I thank my honourable friend for that comment, and indeed it is a comment I am coming to later when I do suggest some ways of saving money in the system. Whole swathes of advice areas are removed from scope, particularly the social welfare law category. Welfare benefits is removed completely from legal aid. Now, on the Ministry of Justice's own Equality Impact Assessment, 63% of clients who received legal aid in this category had a disability. 54% are female, and 27% from a black and minority ethnic background. However, this is justified by stating that the accessible, inquisitorial and user-friendly nature of the tribunal means appellants can generally present their case without any assistance. It also states advice and help are available from a number of sources, including Job Centre Plus and the Benefits Enquiry Line. So people who've had their claim refused by Job Centre Plus or the Benefits Agency are to go to them for support in challenging a decision, and they'll help them. I have to say, that is not the experience I had when I worked for an advice agency. I will give way.
Friends giving way, and on the basis of what my honourable friend has just said, which I support entirely, would my honourable friend be interested to know that the Brighton Housing Trust Eastbourne Advice Centre deals with at least 800 specialist housing cases per year, and they anticipate this would fall to approximately 100. Are they really expecting, or are we really expecting Job Centre Plus to take up the slack? What would my honourable friend have to say?
My honourable member for that intervention. And yes, I totally agree with him. In fact, my local Citizens Advice Bureau has rung 100 times to the Benefits Agency and has had no response apart from saying everyone is busy. These issues are also not considered of a sufficiently high importance. Well, when a person is ill or has a disability, one of their major concerns is having an adequate income to enable a decent quality of life. The early advice available under this funding can actually save money. 80% of social welfare legal aid cases have positive outcomes for clients. And in the agency that I worked, 70% of our reassessment appeals were successful. And that negated the need for a costly tribunal. I'd also like to debunk the myth that these cases aren't complex. My own CAB in Wigan dealt with a case for 3 years where the DWP asserted that a couple were living together as man and wife, despite evidence from a neighbouring local authority that Mr M was resident there and receiving benefits, and that he merely visited to look after his disabled daughter, assisting with her care on occasions. Mrs M was summoned for benefit fraud, convicted and ordered to repay £27,000. The Bureau continued with the case, appealed 3 times, went to the Secretary of State, and at the final appeal, Mrs M was found to owe £236, a reduction of over £26,500. And that wasn't a complex case, and that case would be suitable for a telephone helpline. I don't think so. I think that client needed the face-to-face help given by a skilled CAB advisor and was funded by Legal Help. I'll give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate her on securing this debate. Does my honourable friend agree that the suggestion that legal advice could be provided over the phone fails to understand the level of support that's provided by many legal representatives, particularly when they're dealing with vulnerable groups and potentially when they're dealing with asylum and refugees, often people who face persecution, who are separated from their family and perhaps don't have English as first language?
My honourable friend for that intervention, and I totally agree with her. When people are at a time of stress, they do need the support, quite often, of a friendly face. I'd like to continue by saying for every £1 in legal aid expenditure on welfare benefits in the Wigan Borough, £20.50 of additional benefit per year is obtained for clients. Yep. And nationally, for every £1 of legal aid expenditure on welfare benefit, the state potentially saves £8.80. Yep. I'd like to move on to debt now. I'd just like to make a little bit of progress. I'm afraid the debate is quite late. I'd like to move on to debt, another area removed from scope, except for cases where the client's home is at immediate risk. The impact assessment shows that 55% of debt clients are female, 30% are likely to have a disability, and yet again, the consultation paper believes that although the debt problems are important to the individual, they're not important enough to warrant legal aid funding. However, I have myself seen the effects of debt on individuals and the cost, both human and to the state, including the NHS, of not resolving debt issues at an early stage. A project that I was involved with personally used a recognised NHS scale to monitor stress levels before and after the advice process that dealt with unsecured debts. And our local PCT believed that in the first 9 months of the project, 3 suicides had been prevented. At what cost? In Wigan, my CAB deals with 616 debt clients per year at a cost of £123,000 to the state. They reschedule £4.83 million worth of debt and they write off £3.47 million. Potentially, for this amount of expenditure, £367,000 is saved by spending £123,000. Now, I totally support the expansion of financial education into schools and communities, but this won't assist people who are in debt now. In fact, it's my experience when the issue is raised in schools, more parents arrived at the advice agency's door as they're aware that there's somewhere to go, and they almost feel they've got permission to go there.
Would my honourable friend just give way on debt?
I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend. Every conscientious MP will know the value of citizens' advice bureaus because otherwise our offices would quite simply be swamped, and that prospect awaits us. My honourable friend has highlighted Wigan. In Stoke-on-Trent, the Citizens' Advice Bureau has highlighted that there will be 730 fewer people who will get specialist debt advice. A total of 1,280 people will not get any advice at all. Newcastle-under-Lyme, my area, will be on top of that. Over 1,500 people in North Staffordshire. Would she agree that this is not only a false economy, but really it's a heartless cut as well?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. I completely agree with him. And I will go on to some figures I have on the impact it will have on advice agencies. Agencies providing telephone advice, such as National Debtline, have got a great role to play, but they can't replace face-to-face advice, as my honourable friend mentioned before. The reality is people need to sit down with an advisor, and they need the reassurance and the trust from a relationship that is built up over time. There was a reason that the social welfare law group of problems, including employment, housing, debt and benefit, were primarily given to advice agencies, and that's the interlinking of the problems. Limiting the scope and the type of problems that the advisors can deal with limits their ability to deal with the whole person and all their issues. For example, the legal help might prevent someone losing a home because of debt, but it won't address the causes of that debt, such as unfair dismissal or a refusal of sickness benefits. I could continue to give many examples of other areas that are taken out of scope, but I believe some colleagues, honourable friends, will be also mentioning those. The list is extremely long. Access for the most vulnerable is excluded and severely curtailed in many cases. I turn to the effect on Citizens Advice Bureau and the not-for-profit providers. The Ministry itself estimates that this sector will lose 97% of its legal aid funding. Currently, Citizens Advice Bureau, local Citizens Advice Bureau, receive £26 million of legal aid funding, with debt and benefits being the largest amounts. If these proposals are implemented, then £20 million will go in one fell swoop. There won't only be a significant impact on the ability to deliver legally aidable services, but also on all the other client services.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. There was a survey undertaken by the National Citizens Advice that showed if the proposals went ahead, 80% of your local bureaus, the honourable members' local bureaus, would have to withdraw specialist services. 85% would have reduced capacity to meet clients' needs, and, most shockingly, 51%, over half, felt there would be a risk to the continuation of the whole CAB service in their borough. Yeah. Legal aid funding can't be treated in isolation from other sources of advice funding, especially as the consultation assumes that people can access the other services to pick up the slack. The free advice sector is suffering disproportionately from public funding reductions, and even agencies such as the RNIB, who have no legal aid funding, have approached me, telling me they can't deal with any increase in demand for their services due to the impact of the proposals. I will give way.
And she's making an eloquent case, particularly on behalf of organisations which are currently giving evidence to the Justice Committee on just these matters. But does she recognise that there may be some scope, and ought to be some scope, for looking at some of the sources of some of the problems on which this advice is being sought to provide the funding, whether it's public bodies who make poor decisions, as our honourable friend rightly pointed out, or indeed the banks?
I thank the honourable member for the intervention, and I totally agree there is scope for other funding provision. However, that hasn't been available up to yet. And in fact, provision is being withdrawn with the face-to-face funding going from Citizens Advice Bureau now.
Well, my honourable friend wouldn't she also accept that, of course, need is rising in the present economic climate, need particularly in relation to employment, to social welfare benefits and to debt?
Yeah.
I completely agree. And thank you for the intervention. I thank my honourable friend. I completely agree. This is a time of great change for many of our clients, and the need for legal help is even more vital. I'll now move to the suggested resolution, the Community Legal Advice Helpline, the gateway to civil legal aid services, and the body that will offer non-eligible clients access to paid services. Firstly, I want to take issue with the premise that the legal aid scheme has expanded beyond its original intentions. Actually, the Legal Aid Act 1949 was promoted with very wide objectives that were explained to the other place, and I quote, legal advice for those of slender means and resources, so that no one will be financially unable to prosecute a just and reasonable claim or defend a legal right. I'm not convinced that a gatekeeping telephone helpline will promote this. Access to telephone advice is important, and I would welcome any expansion, but it has to be implemented in tandem with face-to-face services. Clients need to have that choice. The CLA helpline uses an 0845 prefix, which is very expensive from a pay-as-you-go mobile. Many people with learning disabilities or mental health issues prefer to attend in person, to pick up on non-verbal signals and to build the trust necessary to tell the advisors their problem. CAB make a particular effort to reflect the community they serve, and this is why people go to their services. As an aside, I would like to mention volunteers, another place where people can pick up the advice in the consultation paper. There may be an assumption it can be picked up by volunteers, and I don't believe this is the case. Volunteers work best and most confidently, supported and encouraged by specialists. And it's only when this support was provided that the number of volunteers and the depth of the work they undertook increased significantly in the bureau that I managed. There are opportunities to save money in the justice sector without placing the burden on frontline services. The Ministry of Justice intends to reform the Legal Services Commission, and there is a large amount of bureaucracy in the administration of legal aid. I have to say, I spent 60% of my time managing 30% of the money I got. A lighter touch procurement and auditing and payment mechanism could be found, and I think this needs to be looked at seriously.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
Just on the point of volunteers, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I wonder whether you'd agree with this. Many of my colleagues in my chambers and firms of solicitors locally volunteer their services to advice bureaus regularly. But the incidence of that is going to diminish given the dreadful cuts to legal aid to those firms and the very fact that they're not being able to take on trainees as a result of the cuts to them. The advice is diminishing drastically as a result of the cuts of this government.
I thank my honourable friend for that. And I do agree that provision of pro bono advice is important, but it's not available in all places. In fact, in the conurbation that I served, there was no pro bono advice. I will go on to say that decreasing the need for civil legal aid is also important. Again, addressing the poor decision-making by public bodies, avoiding the needs for tribunals. Take the lawyers out of tribunals. Make the legal processes simpler. Improve public legal education. Early advice saves money and it keeps cases out of the courts. The funding for this needs to be looked at instead of salami slicing and looking at what are administratively convenient categories of problems. Provision of advice needs to be organised around the real needs of people, and the person needs to be treated as an individual, not as individual problems. Access to justice is one of the cornerstones of a free and civilised society. It is vital that everyone, particularly the most vulnerable, have equal access to the law, no matter who they are, where they live, or how much money they have. This consultation proposes removing that for large numbers of the most vulnerable. Is this access to justice, or is it justice denied?
Yeah.